Welcome and thank you for joining us for the 2021 OVC Grantee Meeting. Before we begin, we wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. You can also access the reminders in the lobby of the virtual meeting platform under Event Access Navigation and Reminders. To join a session scheduled, please navigate to the session section of the meeting platform and click on the individual session title on the left-hand side of the screen to go live. During the presentation, all participant lines will be muted. At any time, questions can be submitted throughout each session using the Q&A feature located on the bottom of your center of your Zoom window. Before or after meeting sessions, please visit the poster session area of the platform to view innovative work from some OVC grantees. Grantee spotlight videos will also be played during all comfort breaks. We encourage you to join the live comfort break sessions to learn more about the outstanding work of these grantees. All sessions are being recorded and will be accessible to view on the meeting platform for up to 6 months post-event. We are also offering CEUs for participants. Please visit the lobby area for further details. Meeting participants will also receive a meeting evaluation via SurveyMonkey at the conclusion of the meeting tomorrow. Technical support is also available. Contact information can be found in the lobby area of the platform. Now I would like to introduce Dr. Stacy Phillips, Victim Justice Program Specialist with the Office of Victims of Crime, National Program Division with the U.S. Department of Justice. Dr. Phillips has more than 20 years of experience in the victim service field and is a children and youth expert within OVC, focusing on trauma, neurobiological effects on the adolescent brain. Before joining OVC, Dr. Phillips spent 7 years at the DC Child and Family Services Agency, working on child and family protective issues, including grants, program management, needs assessments, and resource development. She co-authored a successful federal grant application for the agency to develop a trauma-informed system of care, oversaw agency grant monitors on compliance, and advised organizations about child research and reform. Dr. Phillips, welcome, and now I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rox. That was a lot. Hi, everyone. My name is Stacy Phillips, and I'm a Victim Justice Program Specialist with OVC. And I am honored to bring everybody together with JBS, but I'm really honored and privileged to introduce you to our new director, Kristina Rose. Chris has more than 20 years experience, not just at the Department of Justice, but in the victim services field and at OVC as well. And she is not only a great leader, but she is incredibly intentional, thoughtful, and as authentic as one could hope for and be. And we had her at OVC before. We were sad when we lost her, and we are all thrilled to have her back. So I am excited to introduce her to you. So ladies and gentlemen, Kris Rose.
Thanks, Stacy. Stacy, I just love hearing doctor before your name. Every time I hear that, it's like, wow. Stacy just got her doctorate not too long ago and did it while working full-time and taking care of a lot of children. Real accomplishment. We're so proud of her. Hello, everyone. I'm honored to join you this week for your virtual grantee meeting. I just want to take a moment first to thank JBS International for hosting today's event, but also for their support for all of you, the service providers, the ones that really are making the biggest impact on the lives of victims and survivors in this area. I also want to just let you know how pleased I am to share a screen even with Dr. Chan Hellman. His research has really changed the way we think about hope and how hope impacts survivors and recovery from trauma. So I just want to let him know how much I admire him, and I'm very happy to have him with us today. And then lastly, I want to thank Stacy for her energy, her enthusiasm, I'm sure that you all get to witness her enthusiasm on a regular basis. But the thing about Stacy is she just brings so much heart to each one of her projects, and we are extremely lucky to have her at OVC. So this program started before I came back to OVC. So I'm just going to take a moment to introduce myself to you because I'm sure that many of us have not met before. So as Stacy mentioned to you, though I'm new to the director role, I was just appointed by the president in July. I'm not new to OVC. So I had served as OVC's deputy director and, spent a lot of my career working on issues around crime victimization, violence against women, criminal justice. I have just been extremely fortunate to have had just amazing jobs in my life that have allowed me to work hand in hand with crime victims and survivors and the people who serve them. And those experiences really grounded me and have informed my priorities as OVC director. One area where I plan to focus over the next 4 years is on identifying creative and innovative ways of expanding access to victim services and increasing service options available to victims so that they and their families can choose the services and support systems that best meet their needs. Now, I know that doesn't sound very groundbreaking. Options and access are so basic to victims' needs, yet there is an incredible burden that is placed on victims that often limits their options and creates huge barriers to access. And this is not acceptable and needs to change. So that's what I am going to be spending my time on for the next 4 years, and among many, many other things, but that is definitely going to be an undercurrent in the work of OVC. But look who I'm talking to. You all know this. Options and access are critical when it comes to dealing with the fallout of the addiction crisis. And, the data point that we hear all the time, 70,000 Americans in 2019 died from drug-involved overdoses, and knowing how many children were impacted by those. And I'm so proud that this program provides the support to kids, young children, adolescents, the ones that are the hidden victims in this addiction epidemic, if you will. When OVC launched the program in FY18, my understanding is it started with 42 awards to grantees in 27 states. And the funding, which was nearly 30 million, supported partnerships between service providers and first responders, who are really the ones who are the first ones to encounter children during an overdose. And it's amazing to think of how far we've come since then. In just those 3 years, we've doubled the number of awards to 76, including 9 tribes. And now our grantees hail from 37 states and 1 US territory. And based on a review of the performance measures that you've all worked so hard in submitting, I know it's not easy. I've been there and I've done that. Between FY19 and 20, almost 10,000 victims were served through the direct services that you provide. Victims of child sexual abuse, child physical abuse, domestic violence. Those were the primary victimization types that we have seen here. And the services that you've provided, whether it's advocacy, crisis intervention, counseling, other types of therapy to deal with the intense trauma that these children have experienced. Looking more broadly, we've moved beyond that initial focus around public awareness of the opioid crisis and assessing victims' needs to really understanding that we need to build stakeholder engagements across the disciplines. We now have a better sense of the intersectionality between addiction, human trafficking, and so many other forms of trauma. And we're looking actively to evolve community partnerships and advance those community responses to drug addiction. But we're still learning. And thanks to you, we know more now than we did before. We are incredibly proud of the work that you all have done to address this gap in crime victim services for child and youth victims of the opioid epidemic. And I know that even through the pandemic, you continued to assist victims. We saw that in the performance measures. And one just side note that if you haven't seen it already, I hope that you will check it out, but we were able to feature this program in the 2021 National Crime Victims' Rights Week video. It's our theme video. We do one every year, and they are all on our website. So definitely check that out. Before I close, I do want to tell you about a new resource that we are making available. And we're hoping that it will inform many of the services and programs that OVC funds, including this one. And it's called the National Center for Culturally Responsive Victim Services. And the goal of the center is to increase access to victim services and compensation in areas that have been historically marginalized and impacted by inequality. And the idea for this center did not come from on high. It was spearheaded by our OVC Communities of Color Working Group. They're just this energetic, really visionary group of individuals who gathered information from our grantees and from the communities that our grantees serve. And they made a decision. They made a decision that this resource was needed, and they brought it to life. Services and programs like the National Center, like this one that you all participate in, they can only get developed because people like you are listening to survivors. And you're giving us that information, you're transferring that information to us. And that is vitally important because we're listening too. We listen to you, we listen to survivors, and we want to keep listening and understanding so that we can better fill the gaps that exist in being able to provide those options and that access to survivors. So we've got a lot of work to do. And going forward, we're going to be looking at family-centered approaches and interventions, building strategies of hope and resilience to address the impacts of addiction, and really to promote healing among survivors. So this week's workshops are going to build on all of your work, highlighting your progressive and innovative approaches to meeting the needs of youth victims of the opioid addiction crisis. Working together, I know that we can all rewrite how our country responds to crime victims and increase their opportunities to find that justice that they desperately seek. I stand with all of you. Thank you so much for your time today, and enjoy the meeting. Over to you, Stacy.
Thanks so much, Chris. Actually, your comments made me even more excited for today. So as usual, she said it so well. You know, we're so excited to have you here. So let me just start by saying welcome again. Welcome to Reflections, proud to look in the mirror. And, you know, I want to welcome everybody from across the country. This is the first all sites grantee meeting that we've had since the inception of the initiative back in 2018, 2019. So it is so exciting to see where we were and where we are now. Even through a COVID pandemic, you pushed through providing direct and indirect services to youth and families because they needed it. And for that, I know that we are at OVC are very grateful. So first, I want to say a huge thank you to JBS International, Kim, Rox, Beth, Carlos, and the entire team of managers. You truly do go above and beyond and set the bar high. And they have worked incredibly hard over the last several months, really putting together the next 2 days and being intentional and thoughtful with really honing in on not just what everybody needs to learn, but what they would want to know as well. And with really pertinent information that can help you not just in your work and in your agencies, but in transforming the lives of the families and youth that you're working with, and even in your own life. Next, I want to say, again, a huge thank you to our OVC grant managers. They oversee 76 grantees by themselves with the help of JBS and those grant managers. And with all their other awards, and they help me. They help me from reviewing documents and resources to sharing feedback and really working directly with JBS and all of the grant managers. So we couldn't do this without them either. I mean, such a huge initiative. Last but not least, I want to thank all of you who are joining, all of your partners, all of the stakeholders involved, and send a big thank you, because we know that you are working tirelessly to help families and youth from this wicked problem of drug addiction. And at OVC, we genuinely appreciate you and all of your dedication. So like I said, JBS and the team have worked incredibly hard to bring you a great next 2 days of presentations. And they were intentional in selecting the speakers and presentations. And I am incredibly excited that I get to introduce our first speaker and our first plenary. I am honored to introduce you to Dr. Chan Hellman with the Oklahoma University Hope Research Center. I was lucky enough to meet Chan about 6 years ago when we started the polyvictimization initiative, and he was the evaluator with our TA provider at the time. And during my own personal life at that time, I was struggling with my middle child, to be honest with you. He was struggling with some mental health issues that stemmed from years earlier from my divorce. He had some depression and anxiety, and he was, what I didn't know, but he was a very low hope child. He was struggling in school. He really didn't have a care in the world. And I really had no idea what I was going to do. We tried everything from medication and therapy I'd been in for years. And I was lucky enough to meet Chan at the polyvictimization kickoff meeting. And when I heard him talk about the science of hope, when I say to you that I knew right away that I had to learn this and I had to understand the application of it, and I wanted to be as close to Chan Hellman as I could. And in a nutshell, we're several years later, that same child, after really implementing the application and the nurturing of hope that I learned from Dr. Hellman, I can say that it transformed our family. It transformed my son's life. He is a high hope kid now. He doesn't struggle in school anymore, and just got off his medication actually this summer. So when I say to you that you're in for a treat, not only will the science of hope help you in terms of dealing with your clients, but it can also be brought into your personal life as well. So ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Chan Hellman.
Well, thank you, Stacy. That was very kind. Thank you, Director Rose, for the introduction, and thank all of you for allowing me to have just a little bit of your time to talk about the science of hope. As Stacy mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Oklahoma and the director of the Hope Research Center. For the last 20 to 25 years of my life, I've been very focused professionally on measuring the impact and outcomes of program services, much like yours. And it was 15 years ago that I was introduced to this concept of hope. And so I'm going to give a presentation in just a moment. And the presentation will go for a short amount of time, and I'll allow for about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. But just want to highlight that this presentation really represents a summary of those 15 years of research. What we know about the science of hope with almost 2,000 published research studies is that our capacity for hope is one of the single best predictors of well-being for children, for adults, and for families. And as I introduce this concept of hope, one of the things that I want to highlight is that for all of this work, hope is not the outcome. The outcome is always well-being in all of the work that we do. Hope is the process. So I invite you to kind of engage and lean into this conversation and learning about the science of hope as I share my screen. Okay. So about 15 years ago, I was doing a housing needs assessment for an organization that provides services to those living with HIV and AIDS. These individuals also are experiencing very extreme poverty, often making daily decisions about where they're going to sleep, where they're going to eat, and more importantly, or as importantly, how they're going to access healthcare. And as we were designing this needs assessment, I was introduced to a young man named David. And David and I had a 10-minute conversation that transformed my life, both personally and professionally. I'm a psychologist by training. And so I really look at the world through that training and that lens. And as David and I began to have a conversation, he shared with me that 3 months earlier, he learned that he was HIV positive. And as David shared this information with me, as a psychologist, I was immediately drawn based upon this question of trying to understand the adversity that he was experiencing and the effect that that adversity was having. That is, I was being driven from this framework of what is wrong with you. And as I began to listen to David, he further shared with me that 2 weeks earlier, he had disclosed to his parents that he was HIV positive. They'd kicked him out of the home, and he had spent the last 2 weeks homeless in downtown Tulsa, which is where I'm from, Tulsa, Oklahoma. And so again, as David is sharing with this information with me, this adversity, I'm really driven to this question of trying to understand what is wrong with him, that I was listening for depression, anxiety, emotional dysregulation, etc. And interestingly enough, David transitioned the conversation towards his future. He shared with me that he was enrolling at the local community college. He understood what his major was going to be, his academic focus. He had already met with an academic counselor, and he knew the courses that he was going to enroll in this first semester. And it just struck me in that moment that I had spent my entire professional career focused on the question of what is wrong with you. And that is evaluating the success and the effectiveness of programs based upon this idea of identifying what is wrong. And effectiveness is evaluated from the framework of reducing what is wrong with you. What David introduced me to, this concept of hope, is that maybe there's an alternative question that we should also consider. That is, what is right with you? What are the strengths that we possess? What are the strengths that can be nurtured that can help us face the adversities that we experience and potentially overcome those experiences so that we might live life well? So that was really my introduction to this concept of hope. And So a lot of my work is in the context of adversity and trauma. This 15 years of work has been focused on domestic violence, child maltreatment, homelessness, food insecurity, etc. I'm really driven by trying to understand three things. What is hope and why does it matter? The second question is, how does trauma and adversity rob us of hope? And then finally, what are the simple strategies that we can use to nurture and restore that hope, again, for children, for adults, and for families? Now, as many of you are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences, the idea that those childhood adversities are quite prevalent across our communities. And at the national level, we know that roughly 2/3 of adults have experienced one or more of those adversities. I'm not going to spend much time on this at all. You're all very familiar with ACEs and the cumulative effect or the dosage effect of these adversities. What I'll highlight is that the average ACE score from the most recent data with the CDC shows an average ACE score across the United States of a 1.61. And I just want to share that with you because I want you to think about the context of the work that you do and sort of how we've been looking at this concept of hope in some fairly high adverse scenarios. So for instance, working with children exposed to domestic violence, we found their average ACE score to be significantly higher than the national average. Adjudicated youth, again, high rate of exposure to those adversities. And then in the state of Oklahoma, our governor and First Lady have declared that Oklahoma is going to become a hope-centered state. So integrating the science of hope across state agencies. And today, in fact, I'm doing training throughout the day with one of our large state agencies. But one of the organizations that we work with, Oklahoma Department of Human Services, in particular with our foster youth who are aging out of the system. This is the average ACE score experienced by foster youth in the state of Oklahoma. So this is really where our work around the concept of hope has been focused, is on those who are experiencing fairly extreme adversity. Now, for me personally, I'm not as interested in what an ACE score might be. I'm much more interested in how does that adversity show up when clients begin to engage in services. So as an example, and just listing some of the sort of the psychological frameworks that are impacted by exposure to adversity. For instance, we know that children and adults who have an ACE score of 1 or higher have significantly lower levels of trust in professionals. Said another way, those individuals have significantly lower levels of trust in you. And so the idea is, how does trauma and adversity rob us of hope? And it is through these opportunities for relationships. And so this is really where that work has been focused, allowing us to create a curriculum to really work with organizations to become hope-centered in their practices. So let's go ahead and jump into this concept of hope. And so what I'd like you to do is to take just a moment and just reflect for a few seconds about, when you hear this word hope, what comes to mind? What do you think of and associate with this word hope? And oftentimes I'll get words like optimism, future will be better, an expectation, positivity, etc. Now, before I show you the definition, I'd also like for you to consider the idea of whether or not you believe that hope is a feeling that we have, an emotion, or is hope a way of thinking? And just take a second to reflect on, in your experience, is hope a feeling that you have, or is it a mindset? And the reason that this is so important is because within the context of hope, the science of hope, we recognize that hope is a mindset, that hope is a way of thinking. And the reason that this is so important is because if hope is truly a way of thinking, then we know we can teach it. If hope was an emotion, then we know that at best we would help people be able to manage it. And so all of this work is framed around the idea that hope can be taught. Hope is something that we can nurture and restore. So here's our definition. Hope is the belief that the future will be better than today and that you have the power to make it so. So real quickly with this definition, if we stopped with the first half, that is, hope is the belief that your future will be better than today. If we stopped there, then that really is optimism. But optimism is really just a future expectation. Hope goes beyond optimism by saying that you have the power to make it so. So in this framework, hope is about taking action to pursue that future. Now, one of the things that I absolutely love about this concept of hope is its simplicity. It's a very simple concept. And so hope is made up of these three components: goals, pathways, and willpower. Goals are the cornerstone of hope. From the moment you wake up until the moment you go to bed, each and every one of us are goal setting. We're driven by our goals, whether in the short term or the long term. We are pursuing goals on a daily basis. The question is whether or not we have the ability to identify the pathways, that is, the roadmaps that we have to get there from here. Pathways thinking is really the planning piece. It is the ability to identify barriers and to begin the problem-solving process to either overcome those barriers or to find alternative routes. And then finally, the willpower piece is the mental energy. It is the motivation that we have to focus our attention and intention upon those pathway pursuits: goals, pathways, and willpower. Now, what we need to know is that both willpower and pathways are required for us to be hopeful. Now, on the one hand, it may be that we're highly motivated for a particular goal. We have a lot of willpower, a lot of energy towards that future. But if we don't know how to get there from here, that would result in lower hope. Alternatively, it may be that we know how to get there from here. We have the pathways. We're just not motivated to do that work. Again, a framework that represents lower hope. Now, the reason that I wanted to spend a little bit more time thinking about goals, pathways, and willpower is because I want to challenge you to consider this, that when I first began to consider hope as this future expectation based upon my ability to set goals, find pathways, and generate the willpower, what I recognized is that this language of hope actually describes the work that each and every one of you are doing. Each and every one of your programs are in fact those pathways of hope, that your program services are the strategies by which to achieve those goals. The difficult part is the willpower piece, getting individuals and families to dedicate that attention and that willpower towards those pathway pursuits, that each and every one of you are in fact pathways of hope. So for me, in all of this work around hope, the power of hope is really the language. It offers a shared language by which each and every one of you, in terms of the grantees, all have this shared common language that you are pathways of hope. So now that we know that hope is based upon these three dimensions, what I'd like for you to do is take just a moment and reflect on the idea or the way in which we typically use hope in our everyday conversations. So it's very common for us to say things like, I hope you have a great day. I hope you're well. I'm in Oklahoma and we're supposed to have storms tonight. So it's pretty common for us to say things like, I hope there are no tornadoes today. The problem is that in this context of hope, the idea that I hope there are no tornadoes, it is true that I have a lot of willpower, that I have a lot of mental energy around the idea of these storms. The problem is that I have no control over the weather. That is, I have no pathways by which to control the weather. And so what I want us to recognize is the distinction between hoping and wishing, because typically when we use the word hope, what everybody hears is the wish. And the difference between hoping and wishing is that when we have a wish, we have the willpower or the desire for the outcome, but no pathways. So in this regard, a wish is passive towards the goal. Hope is about taking action to pursue that goal. So this is an important distinction. Now, one of the things that we've really been focused on is how does trauma and adversity influence goals, pathways, and willpower. So what I want to highlight is what the research that we've done, how does this experience and exposure to adversity influence the nature of the goals that we set? And here is one of what I think is one of the most profound things that we've discovered in our research. And that is when we are in the presence of adversity, when we are coming from a history of trauma, we're much more likely to set goals that are avoidant in nature. That is, we tend to set goals focused on things that we do not want to occur. Whereas when we nurture and restore that hope, we're much more likely to set achievement-oriented goals. And I'll give you a really quick example to highlight this. So imagine a basketball player who steps out on the court, and the basketball player has a mindset that I want to get the ball and shoot the winning shot for my team. This is an achievement mindset. But imagine the same basketball player that steps out on the court and their mindset is, I hope nobody throws me the ball because I'll probably lose it and disappoint my team. So this is an avoidant mindset. And you can imagine how each of those two basketball players behave on the court or on the court. And so the nature of the goals that we set influences the way we think about how to get there. The other thing that we've learned is that individuals and families who are experiencing adversity and trauma are much better at short-term goal setting. So if I'm in the context of surviving, trying to figure out where I'm going to sleep, where I'm going to eat, am I going to be able to be safe, then my survival hope is very focused in the short term. And if somebody asks me what my goals for the future are, that probably has no meaning to me whatsoever. I'm much more focused in that short term. We've also learned that individuals with a history of trauma really struggle at the pathways piece. In particular, as they begin the journey to go down those pathways, the first time that they hit a barrier, they are much more likely to quit in their pathway pursuits than somebody who has higher levels of hope. And then finally, what we know is that willpower becomes focused on fear of the future or rumination on the past. Now, what research shows with willpower is that it is a very limited resource. So each and every one of us experience from time to time going home at the end of the day being emotionally exhausted or mentally exhausted. This is what I'm talking about in terms of that depletion of willpower. Willpower is a limited resource. We only have so much to give. The other thing that research shows is that our willpower is connected to the glucose in our system. Now, as you know, glucose is our source of energy. And when the glucose begins to deplete, so too is our ability for willpower is also depleted. The significance of this is that when that willpower is depleted, we tend to struggle with self-regulation. That is, we have a much harder time regulating our thoughts, our emotions, and our behaviors. We're much more likely to become impulsive. we're much more likely to become explosive over very small details. Now, one of the things that I'll show us very quickly is sort of this experience of hope, of setting goals and finding pathways. So in this particular experience, what I want to highlight and ask each of you to consider is to just think or ask those of you in the audience, how many of you know how to drive or have attempted to drive a manual transmission vehicle? And so what I want us to do is see the interplay between goals, pathways, and willpower in this hypothetical scenario. So let's say that our desired goal is that we want to drive, and the only pathway we have available to us is a manual transmission vehicle. And so what I'd like for us to do is to consider this hypothetical scenario where we're going to drive a manual transmission vehicle for the very first time. Now, for those of you who have had this experience, what I'd like for you to do is just remember the anxiety, the excitement, the fear of driving that car for the very first time. Now, in this particular hypothetical scenario, what I'd like for you to consider is the idea that let's go ahead and imagine that we are parked uphill. That is, when we let that clutch out for the first time to try to move the car forward, we're going to have to go uphill. And then the final piece of adversity, let's go ahead and say there's a brand new BMW parked immediately behind us. So we're going to drive this manual transmission for the vehicle for the very first time, going uphill with a brand new BMW parked immediately behind us. So as you start the car and you slowly let that clutch out, as you let that clutch out, what I want you to imagine is what is your goal in that moment? Now, some of you are thinking, don't hit the BMW or don't stall the engine. And what I'll highlight is that that's an avoided goal. And when we are in the presence of stress, we are more likely to set those avoidant goals. It's very common and natural for us. So let's just go ahead and imagine that we let that clutch out. We didn't hit the BMW, but we immediately killed the engine. That is, we failed at our attempt to pursue the goal. So what I want you to do is imagine what is going through your mind about your ability to drive. And we're probably thinking things like, I can't do this, I'll never be able to do this, etc. And this is what we find is the self-limiting conversations that we have with ourselves in these lower hope scenarios. But for those of you who know how to drive a manual transmission vehicle, what I want to ask you is when you failed at that first attempt, why didn't you quit? And typically the reason is because we desired the goal. That is, we wanted to drive. And so what we've learned is that the more we desire the outcome, the more we're more likely to overcome the adversities to try to, again, achieve those goals. So the important takeaway there is that the goal has to be desired, and we have to remember that it's their goal, not our goal for them. Okay, so going back to this scenario, let's say that we start the vehicle back up, we let the clutch out, and this time we lurch forward. We're actually driving now. So practice makes perfect, and we're going to go ahead and try this again. So we turn the car off, pull over, park, turn the car off. And so we're starting the car back up. And as we let the clutch out this time, we stall the engine. But what I want you to consider now is the change in mindset. So what are we saying to ourselves now about our ability to drive? And typically what we would hear is, well, I've done it before, I can do it again. And so this highlights the basic idea that hope begets hope. Hope begets hope. That is, that one opportunity for success demonstrated to me that the future is possible. Even if it's luck, the future is possible. And so pretty soon we learn how to drive. So the question becomes, how well can you manage your willpower during this process? Now, remember, willpower is a limited resource. And what I want you to consider is that if your program services are in fact pathways of hope, begin to examine your program service processes as these small benchmarks. And to what extent do your program services make the assumption that individuals and families can dedicate all of that willpower towards those goals? Because remember that willpower is a limited resource, So I'm going to be coming to a close here pretty quickly so we can maybe engage in a little bit of Q&A. But I'd like for you to consider what is the opposite of hope? What is the opposite of hope? Now, my guess is that many of you are thinking despair. Despair is the opposite of hope. And what we've learned is that it's actually apathy. Apathy is the opposite of hope. That is, when we begin to look at a goal and in our mind, no matter what we do, we're going to fail. So why try? That is apathy. Despair is still an important part of hope because I still have a lot of willpower towards the goal. It's just that with despair, I begin to experience a sense of urgency. And in that sense of urgency, I may begin to engage in desperation, desperate acts to pursue and achieve that goal. So this is where most of our work is at, is despair and apathy, because we're interested in how to nurture and restore that. The good news is that hope can be taught. We know that we can nurture hope, and we know the strategies to do this. We've developed a curriculum and worksheets and have shown time and time again that we can see significant increases in hope in about an hour or less. We found this and published this with high trauma children as well as high trauma survivors. And so we know how to do this process. So the process begins with the idea of setting goals, finding those pathways, and engaging that willpower. And as a final kind of piece, I want to show you a real quick body of evidence. These are the high ACE score youth, about 3,000 youth that we've studied across 25 states, high rate of exposure to that adversity. And so we created a non-therapeutic, hope-centered process, and which the camp counselors, it's 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old camp counselors that we train in the science of hope. And what we see in 1 week of this intervention is a significant increase in these high trauma exposed youth. Now, what I'm going to invite you to do as I come to a close, what I'd invite you to do is to look at the difference between the pre-test score and the post-test score, those 2 points. The power of hope is that those 2-point increase in hope actually predicted a letter grade change in the classroom for these youth. That's the power of hope. So I think I'll go ahead and stop sharing my screen. And I think we're coming towards the end of my time. So might have time for one or two questions. Roxanne may ask for some help just in terms of managing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Hellman. You do have a couple questions that have come in through the Q&A. And just a reminder to everyone, on the bottom Zoom, you should have a Q&A feature so you can submit your questions or comments through there. The first one is, what are some ways to introduce hope to others to help them understand it and how it impacts or can impact their lives?
Yeah, so very good. Well, one of the things that we were fortunate enough to do a couple of months ago is I was able to give a TED Talk. So there's a nice little 15 or 20-minute video that's a pretty nice resource. They did a really good job on the productivity. I think the important piece is to introduce the definition and the 3 components: goals, pathways, and willpower, and to begin to distinguish that from wishing, which is the way we typically consider that. For me, the real power of hope is in the science. 2,000 published studies, focused on physical health, mental health, social well-being, education outcomes, criminology, etc. One of the single best predictors of well-being. And what I would highlight is that you start small. Always remember that goals are the cornerstone. And don't just start with the idea of, hey, what are your goals for the future? So for instance, if I know that Stacy, for example, is experiencing pretty extreme adversity, maybe she's close to apathy. If I ask her what her goals are in general, she's going to give me a fairly agitated response that's going to be something like, I don't know, I don't have any goals. But if I remember that we're much better at the short term than the long term, then maybe what I do is begin to lean into, Stacy, what are your goals this week? Or it may be that I become really focused and say, Stacy, what are your goals in work this week? What are some goals in your family life, et cetera? And try to really get that into a shorter framework. I tried to answer Stacy's question at the same time.
Yeah, I was about to, that way I could jump into the next one. The next one is there a certification or training that is accessible to teach the curriculum mentioned? If yes, how do we access it?
Yes, there is. It's the Hope-Centered Trauma-Informed Curriculum that we've developed and tested. You can go to chanhellman.com. That's where a lot of the resources are. My colleague and co-author Casey Gwynn and I wrote a book called Hope Rising that has sort of the overarching framework. But we do have a curriculum, 3 levels of training that include a 4-hour hope awareness and then a deep dive, which is an additional 12 hours of Hope Navigator training, which is really about the implementation of hope within organizational practices. So we do have it available. It is described on the website. So.
Okay, and then the next one is, where can I find more resources on teaching hope to clients? We provide direct counseling and group work to children impacted by substance use in the family.
Yeah, so there's a lot of really good sources just in terms of Google. There's a document available called Making Hope Happen. I've been working with a lot of school districts to build curriculum for children, for especially really young children, including 3-4-year-olds, all the way through high school. And one of the things that I would invite you to consider is in Oklahoma, Union Public Schools have created 120 25-minute curriculum pieces. So that's one pretty good resource. One way to do it really well with children is through story and movies. So for instance, as you're reading a book with children, you can occasionally stop and explore and discuss goals of the main character, pathways, what are the barriers, how did they overcome those barriers? And so for really young children, I do like to use story as an example of how to engage in that process. And what you'll find in those children's stories and movies is that, quite frankly, every one of them are about hope in some fashion.
Okay. And then the last question that I see that came in is, have you found that people have natural levels of hope? If yes, what impacts this in your opinion or based on your research?
Yeah, so trauma and adversity really rob us of hope. And so we're seeing this especially in the school work that we're doing, where teachers and counselors are really having to increasingly respond to the adverse experiences of children, and obviously not always equipped to deal with that. And so, this idea of what we know, for instance, from the ACEs science, the robust data from that. And so from my perspective, the reason why we talk about this as hope-centered and trauma-informed is because we acknowledge and understand and really delve into that trauma-informed care framework that has evolved from movements like the adverse childhood experiences. But pretty soon we ask ourselves, and this has happened to me in every scenario, is once we begin to create an awareness around hope, the question becomes, what do we do about that? And our focus on research over the last 15 years is hope is what you do about that. Even with individuals who are in despair and apathy, we know we can move the needle.
Thank you, Dr. Hellman. I know we're up on time, and we will be developing a frequently asked question document to, include any questions that we didn't get to today, and to share all the great resources from presenters.